Hi everyone, this is Counseling 2250, Robinson, Chapter 4, Identities as Status. The contextual and social construction of differences models. So what this chapter is really about is to understand how who you are as a person can either give you status or take away your status. And you'll probably hear this a lot if you are aware of social justice issues. And this chapter is going to be like a really good intro to the different dynamics of what status is and how is it defined in America as well as the rest of the world. All right, sociologist Hughes talked about problems of occupational and assigned status. So for example, when you hear kindergarten teacher, you will automatically think a female gender, right? You unconsciously assume this, which means that even without knowing it, this is what you have in your head. If I asked you, or say, what do you think a doctor looks like? Most likely they're gonna say a male, right? So these are things that we are raised with, these assumptions, these cultural constructs, social constructs that are ingrained into our heads. And during this time, especially with millennials and Gen Z, you guys are really questioning all these things and really seeing, hey, these are things that have been automatic. We need to challenge these things so that it will encourage people to change and be themselves. And of course, obviously, when we have these assumptions, they are influenced by the media, by educational systems, by the clergy, and as well as our own families. So here is another example. When you do not fit into the automatic thought, you are seen as suspicious. So let's take just the idea of the President of the United States, right? Automatically, most of us think of a white or Caucasian male, and that's it, right? But when we see, let's say, President Barack Obama, when he was running, and you could clearly see this, is that people were like going, is he even an American citizen? Was he born in America? Because he doesn't look like what we think Americans are, right? Which are white people. People also say, is he even Christian as his religion? Because his name is Barack Hussein Obama, a lot of people, or some people actually, thought maybe he was Muslim or whatever. And then people are like, would we want a Muslim president? Right? And so these are things that when you don't fit into that stereotypical, let's say, white Caucasian male, people start to go, I wonder if he is really legit. Okay. If there is success for minorities, people will assume that it's because they're filling a quota, right? Or it's unfair and they're probably undeserving. There's maybe some injustice or reverse racism. Reverse racism, let me just explain really quickly, is kind of like affirmative action, where basically you're saying that we need to have people of color in here because we don't like white people, right? And that's not, that doesn't make sense, unfortunately, because if you have, if you are born Caucasian, people just assume that you belong. Okay, so having affirmative action, again, this is a very long-winded conversation that we can have, but I just wanted to kind of explain what reverse racism or how it's seen as, okay? And then, of course, favoritism or just pure luck that they're there. Not that they don't necessarily deserve it or have the right to be there or that they're smart enough to be there and stuff like that. And that's what happens when a person doesn't necessarily look like the status quo or what typically is. People go, hey, I wonder whether or not they really legitimately deserve this. Race is a determining trait. It overpowers everything. We're talking about racism, sexism, and homophobia are interlocking systems of oppression. Marginalized groups have stigmas to them. So stigma is basically kind of, well, let's see the definition here, which is a bodily sign designed to expose something unusual and bad about the moral status of an individual. So basically we have assumptions about certain things about a person, usually negative stuff about that, right? We're talking about, let's say, disability. There's a negative stigma on that they're not able to do things, let's say. Model of socially constructed and contextual discourses in the United States is based on race, gender, class, all are social constructs. What social constructs are is basically things that don't necessarily have value until a society puts value on there. Okay, social constructs such as men are better than women, right? So then men are preferred over women in a society. So that's just a social construct. There's really no evidence that men are better than women or women are better than men. It's just something that we just decided, right? Another example would be boys. The color for boys is blue and the color for girls is pink. Really, there's no reason why, right? Why couldn't it have? It could have been boys is green and girls are yellow, but we don't have a real reason why. It's just society somehow decided it, and then we all just kind of accepted it. Okay, they matter because society wants it to matter. When we think of an American, we usually think of whiteness or being a Caucasian person, male, upper or middle class, someone who is Christian, someone who is straight or heterosexual, who speak English, and of course is youthful, right? Kind of like, middle age or younger. So basically that is now considered what normal is in America. But obviously as people of color, you're going to go, well, that's a little ridiculous, but it is true. We accept it, right? When we think of an American, we don't necessarily think of people of color. We think of a white person. The other is seen as different from the norm and lesser than the norm. So what happens is if you are an American and you are not what we just said, suddenly people might go, where are you from? And if you say something like, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, they're going to go, no, where are you really from? Right? Because they don't really believe that you are from here. But if it's a white male who goes, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, you're going to go, oh, okay, right? Even though we know controversially in the past, really Native Americans or indigenous people are really the original Americans, right? So it is an issue with history, and we'll talk about that as we go along through this chapter as well. So there are also assumptions of hierarchical socialization patterns. And what that is just a fancy way of saying that there is a level of what is considered acceptable and what are not acceptable. So differences among people and between people have rank, value, and function. So we always are trained to believe that our automatic thoughts is that normal is desirable, right? So being a white male is desirable because they have it all, right? That's the illusion or the idea that we have in our head because we're trained to believe this or taught to believe this. So people who are old, right? Obviously, then people are going to go, I don't know about that. Being plus size, being curvy, right, is not necessarily celebrated, although it is changing. I'm not going to deny that. Definitely you millennials and you Gen Zers and stuff like that have really challenged a lot of these social constructs and hierarchies. And of course, being a short man, right? And I know that you guys are probably going to go, well, yeah, being a short person is totally fine. But usually if we were in class and I asked the ladies, typically it's ladies, would you ever date a guy who was shorter than you? A lot of you guys will be very uncomfortable and kind of don't want to say that you would not want a shorter boyfriend or partner, right? So just think about your inherent biases that you were taught or led to believe, right? Now let's talk about racism. Social construction based on socio-political attitudes that demean specific racial characteristics and use superiority as an answer to discomfort about differences. So let's give you an example. Incorrect belief that Caucasians are the best. Assessments to determine abilities and intelligence. So these are things that happen that then is related to racism. Right? It excludes minorities from resources and power and blame them for their failures. So if you don't give them the same opportunities and then you blame them for not having those opportunities to succeed, do you understand how disconnected that is, right? Disjointed that is. Caucasians are often reluctant to engage in dialogue about the realities of racism. In social justice, people want to explore sanitized histories. So before we go further along, I know that we talk about the word Caucasian and we talk about, some of them not willing to talk about racism. This is not an attack on Caucasian people. If you are Caucasian, we're born into certain levels of privilege, and we'll talk about that in the future. But I just wanted to preface this, okay? So it is not your fault, okay? This is society's creation that happens to favor people who are Caucasian or white, right? So just because you're born white, we're not saying that you have not suffered, okay? You could have, right? And that, you could live in poverty too, along with other people. However, if we, let's say, put you in a line compared to other people, minorities, and then they'll say, who is most likely to be successful? Most likely people are going to choose the person who is white or Caucasian and say, yeah, I trust them the most, or I believe that they probably have the best skill sets or opportunities or potential, right? So in social justice, people want to explore sanitized histories. What that basically means is that because of how America was created, we tend to, or people who have created the history of America tend to have not mention, let's say, the bad things that Caucasian or colonizers have done in the history, right? I'll give you an example. Christopher Columbus, right? He discovered America, but we don't really talk about the fact that he also ruined a lot or harmed, let's say, a lot of Native American lives. And we'll talk about that as we go further in this chapter. But so we grow up thinking, oh yeah, the pilgrims came to America and, they were good people. They might have suffered through the winter and the Native Americans helped them. But really there was a lot more to it, right? And there was a lot more violence. But we don't hear about that because we don't want to see ourselves as being evil, right? We're talking about America, basically, not me or anything like that. Does that make sense? Hopefully this helps as we go along in this chapter. African Americans have a long history as an oppressed minority because of slavery. They were believed to be inferior. When slaves tried to run away, diagnosed with, I believe it's drapetomania, or if they were rebelling, dyskinesia ethiopica, which basically is just diseases or mental issues that were made up to make it as a reason to justify what was going on. So influences how African Americans mistrust mental health, government, and authority is because they didn't want to be slaves and then they were deemed mentally, inferior, or there was problems with them, right? When really, who wants to be a slave? No one wants to be a slave, right? But there were conditions like violence and death if they did not remain a slave during that time period. People see African Americans as childlike. That means kind of like naive, like don't really know a lot, incapable of providing for themselves, and dependent upon their benevolent white masters. So as you can see, this is how people have cornered African Americans in America, right? To be viewed as this. And because many, many people say it over and over and over again, people start to believe it, right? And just accept it and say, well, that's what African American people are like, or Black people are like. And that's not true. Again, these are social constructs. Again, the sanitization of history also is a major part as well. And during now, which is, 2020, a lot of people are bringing up the fact that this is all incorrect, right? That this is just all social constructs that need to be torn down. Right here is a link to a thing called microaggressions are like mosquitoes. Please take your time after this lecture to click on it so you can understand what microaggressions are. Sometimes we think we know what microaggressions are, but this cartoon really does an amazing explanation of what it is. But what it is, just briefly, is that when one group of people say to another group of people a compliment, but it really isn't a compliment. Instead, that compliment really reminds the person that they're different. They're not normal, like we said before. And so then it becomes not really a compliment, but really a reminder or an insult that you are not part of this society. Like a reminder and stuff like that. But the video explains it even better. I don't want to go further because I think the video is actually even better. Oppression has health consequences as well. So people get high blood pressure from the stressors of oppression. Disparities in access to healthcare is also another reason why. They don't get the same amount of healthcare. Even if they, let's say, go to a doctor might not treat them as respected people or as people in general than, let's say, a person who is considered Caucasian or white. Okay. And I know for some of you guys, you're like, no, that's not really true. But there are many people, and this is surveys and stuff like that. This is not just a story that someone heard from someone. That's called an antidote. An antidote is also fine, or anecdote. I'm sorry, and a story that you hear from a cousin or something like that is not the same thing as research, which says that people of color are treated less at a medical facility and stuff like that. Okay, there's also, let's talk about white privilege, which we did mention a little bit before. There is a abbreviation called WMWP, which stands for well-meaning white person. They do not understand the social constructs of race, the impact of daily racism on people of color, and their role in the perpetuation of inequality. So here's an example right here in this image of a Band-Aid, right? This is probably called a nude colored Band-Aid. But nude color, which means like skin color, right? Skin tone, for whom? Is this a skin tone for a person who is black or African American? No, right? So already right there, we make assumptions already that the normal, the typical person is the skin color, and not the fact that we acknowledge that there's many different skin colors, right? And so again, these are just things that we just accept, right? You can hide, let's say, an injury with a Band-Aid if you are Caucasian with this Band-Aid. But if you're trying to hide it and make it discreet on a person who has darker skin color, it's not. It's going to stand out. People are going to see it, right? And we're going to explain all this stuff as well in the sense of the social construction of race. And part of it is when you don't have to worry about certain things in life, you might not think about it. Right? And that's what they're saying here is that a well-meaning white person might not necessarily understand race issues because they didn't have to deal with it when they were younger up to their adulthood, right? How many times have you heard lately where a black parent will say, you know, I have to teach my child how to behave in front of police officers so that they're not killed or hurt, right? For a typical person who's white or Caucasian, most likely their parents were like, you know, when you need help, you call the police, right? But the thing is, when you are a person of color and you call police, there is already a suspicion that you are not there for a legit reason, that you might actually be the person who's harming other people as opposed to the victim, right? So again, this is just all conversation. I hope that if there's any people who are identify as white or Caucasian, does not think that there's, when we talk about race, that we're attacking people who are white or you, okay? We're attacking the idea of it because it's been socially accepted in a big picture, which then ends up harming other people who are different or different looking. Lack of awareness about the circumstances that entitle groups to privileges, and difficulty grasping that others who do not share the immutable group membership also do not share those privileges. Okay, so what that is basically saying is when you are raised in a world where you don't have a lot of worries, you're not going to go, you're gonna like, life is wonderful, life is great. But when you compare it to a person who is a minority because of their skin tone or whatever, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I actually have had it better than other people just because of the way I look. Again, it's not blaming you, right? It's just, it happens that if you look a certain way, you might get better things. Just think about being attractive, right? Like if you're really pretty, you're probably going to get more things than if you're considered not socially as pretty, right? So I hope this lecture really starts to open up your thinking and understanding of the world. And this is why also right now, you'll see people going, and a lot of white people or Caucasian people saying, this is how you can help people of minority, and recognizing their biases and acknowledging that there is privilege, okay? And but that you're willing to also help the people who don't have that privilege in one way or another. Okay, now let's talk about the patriarchy. Patriarchy means basically male-led or fatherly figure-led. It's their ranking is higher. Often you hear the word patriarchy with the word matriarchy. Matriarchy with an M means female-led, motherly, nurturing. Okay. Anyway, so with the patriarchy, it is basically where men have advantage conferred on them because of their prescribed rank of societal status, which basically means if you are male, you're probably more respected and you already have higher rank than a female. If there's two people there, and if you ask them who do you think is smarter, most likely most of us will say the man, right? And again, that's because we were taught that men are better than women and stuff like that. You guys, you younger kids, might not realize this, but this actually does happen. We hear about, I don't know if you've heard this before, but when there are, let's say in an Asian culture, it's very, very patriarchal. So you'll hear people say, I'd rather have a son than a daughter, okay? And why? Is because there's this prescribed patriarchy that has been instilled into the society, okay? And it's really hard to break this idea, right? And this is why you'll see when there's a doctor, or there are two doctors, a male and a female, usually people will prefer the male doctor because they seem smarter and all this stuff, when it truly doesn't necessarily mean that at all. It's not true, okay? Biological sex is not chosen, but it is an extremely powerful determinant of how people have been and continue to be treated. So what they're saying is that, you're just born who you are, but it just happens that when you are born male, you just get more advantages in life. Women under 25 are on par with men in labor participation. So what that basically means is, if you're under 25, men and women both are kind of treated equally in the sense of work, right? But the thing is, after 25, if you think about this, women are expected to have children and maybe become housewives and stuff like that. So their work is going to be different, or their labor participation will be different. Think about right now during a pandemic, a lot of women are actually leaving their jobs to stay at home to take care of their children because school doesn't exist right now. Okay, so gender and racial inequality still exists, or inequity still exists. It contributes to a skewed emotional existence, which basically means that we feel differently about this, and men are not expressed by men, or things that are not allowed or permitted, right? Is fear, vulnerability, or uncertainty. So although men are put on a higher level, they also do have some pressures also that exist within their own maleness, right? Which is, if they're scared, they can't really say that they're scared, because then people will make fun of them and say, are you a girl? Are you a sissy? And other ruder words, right? And again, even when you hear the word sissy and a girl, those are considered put downs, right? But really these words mean female. So why are things that are considered put downs always female related, right? That's unfair. And you guys are actually starting to change that, your generation, which is amazing. Women who are respected in a patriarchy often act more masculine. So now let's talk a little bit about, how some women adapt to be living in America or in society. Are they given respect because they're acting like men, right? If you see a tough woman, more manly woman or masculine looking woman, you tend to give her probably more respect and more knowledge. You probably just assume that she knows a lot more than a very feminine, girly, let's say, female, right? Do you? I don't know. What do you guys think? Typically, that's what happens, okay? Because they seem to be stronger looking, right? So we just assume they are stronger. Are you respecting them for the manliness and further saying that men are better than women? So just because the women are acting more like men, is that why they are better, right? And society will probably say, yeah, unfortunately, right? We're not talking about sexy or anything like that. We're just talking about privileges, opportunities, and it becomes a catch-22. If you want to be a female and a feminine female, you are less likely to be as respected and treated as an equal, okay? Swanson talks about the new sexism. Some men, rather than feeling like patriarchs, often feel like workhorses. A workhorse is basically someone who just is, expected to do all work all the time and just not, enjoy life. So it's interesting, and it's very, very real, is that for some men, they don't feel like they're actually powerful. They feel burdened of being a family provider and trying hard to avoid financial debt, right? So a lot of men, They're like, well, I have to bring home the bacon, right? So they have to make money because I have to provide for my wife and my children. So that's a lot of stress to make money, right? I don't know if that's how you feel or not, but it is very stressful to have to pay rent or pay a mortgage, buy all the food, take care of the children, take care of your wife, buy a car, 2 cars, all these things. And some men feel that way, and some women encourage it, you know. And again, if it's happy for you guys, then that's great. Um, but why is it that some men feel so overexhausted because of it? And that's part of it is because, again, social constructs are not necessarily going to help everyone. There's going to be some bad stuff and good stuff in everything, right? Conditioned to be providers, protectors, and ready for combat. Some of you guys don't want to fight, but you're expected to fight because other people expect you to fight because you're a guy, right? Yet women pressure them to also be nurturing, soft, and intimate. So within men, seen by other men, they have all these strong attributes that they have to always portray. And then when they're with women, they have to have these other things. So it becomes a really heavy burden when they feel like they have to do 2 things, maybe hide one set of things in front of the men, like not be nurturing, not be soft in front of other men, you know, and then they can't be very tough and rude and competitive with women. It can be very, very mentally exhausting as well. Men feel conflicted since strong men are not supposed to show vulnerability. Yeah, at the same time, we're like, no, men can cry, right? I hope that you think that and believe that men should be able to cry if they want to and not be put down and called names. Now let's talk about sexism, an institutionalized system of inequality based on biological sex. Women's movement challenged stereotypes about women, women's work, and their place in society. So when the women's movement started, I would say probably the 70s was a really big, big time. But obviously there were other times before that when women were able to vote and all that other stuff, right? But the movement and the academia of understanding and research about women's responsibilities and roles in life were really examined in the 70s. And they talked about, you know, what are women supposed to be? Housewife, mother, and all this stuff. So if a woman is not a mother, suddenly she feels like she's not as good as other women, right? Or other mothers, right? And it's okay if women choose not to have children. Don't you think? You guys probably think so. But back in the olden days, back to 30 years ago, 20 years ago, you know, 10 years ago, people did look down on women who could not have babies or chose not to have babies. They're like, ooh, what's wrong with her? Okay. Women want equal pay for equal work, which is very true. Does it happen all the time? Unfortunately, no. And I know for a lot of you guys, you're like, well, no, I get paid the same as my male counterparts. It actually happens a lot more being paid equally when you're younger. But as you get older and you go into your profession, you will realize that women actually get paid less than men for the same job. There's actually an article that came out recently in an Ivy League school where women were actually paid, the women professors were paid less than the male professors. And so there was a lawsuit, and then the Ivy League school decided to pay out, I think, multi-million dollars to the women to make it more equal, or make it equal. Respect in society, who turns them into sexual objects? So that's another area too, right? Women are always expected to be sexy or beautiful, you know, for the male gaze, for the men who are like going, you need to look this way, you know? And some women will go, I need to look this way because I want men to like me and find me attractive and validate me. And it becomes very complex and complicated. It becomes a cycle too, right? And we see in Gen Z, you know, women are not necessarily shaving their legs or their armpits and stuff like that. And that is considered crazy for a lot of typical society, right? Men, think about it. If you're a heterosexual or straight guy, would you date someone, a female, with hairy legs as much as your hair is on your legs or your armpits? Huh? Would you date a woman who doesn't wear makeup? Who doesn't do their hair? Who has a short haircut? Probably not, unfortunately. And part of that is because of how society has groomed us to believe that women should look a certain way. And this is kind of part of the whole male gaze. Okay? Denied rights to their own bodies and minds. And then again, that's another thing that's happening on the Supreme Court is the fact that abortion is something that Many women believe that they have a right to their own bodies to do whatever they need to do with their own bodies, right? But the society is saying, no, we don't believe women should have abortions. And that's kind of weird, right? Or I don't know. How do you feel about it? Is it religion imposing their ideas and thoughts and values onto everyone? But not everyone's the same religion. So how does that happen? How does that work? Okay, now let's talk about gay white men versus gay men of color, right? Gay white men, since skin is often the first way people are perceived, being gay does not take away from being white and being male. Because when people see you as a white male, they will automatically give you privilege and power and opportunities. However, gay men of color have male privilege with the culture. However, they have to live with racism and homophobia. Okay, so you can see the differences between the two. Men are oriented towards success, competition, need to be in control. Again, we teach men to do these things as they're younger and as they grow older, right? Where you, if you were born male or if you had a sibling who was male, when they cried or whatever when they were younger, did their parents go, you shouldn't cry because you're a boy. Only girls cry, right? Again, they are conditioned, and so there's a lot of stress on them to perform and behave in a very specific way. Danger of sexism is that men are expected to be type A behavior patterns. And if you don't know what type A is, it's basically they're more dominant and in control. They are assertive, they're competitive. They can actually be very impatient as well. Men are therefore connected to depression because of these expectations. Because not all men can uphold all these things, you know? If they're not able to have a balanced life, they're going to potentially become depressed and then maybe, like, let's say use drugs or drink to cope with it, right, in an unhealthy way. Being gay is seen as a flaw or abnormality. Do you guys agree? Maybe not. You guys are younger and you guys are like, yeah, being a gay is okay. But before your generation, a lot of people did not see gay people as okay, and said that they were actually mentally ill. Okay. Seen as promiscuous. Promiscuous means basically sleeping around. Judged on their mannerisms and dress, right? People make fun of them, their flamboyantness and stuff like that. To be untrusted around young children because people think that they are child molesters. Can you believe that? People used to think that gay people are child molesters just because they're gay. Those are pedophiles. Pedophiles and gay people are two different things. They're not related. There are pedophiles who love little boys and pedophiles who love little girls, right? We're not talking about that. Gay men are not pedophiles. Those are two different things. But for some reason, society has lumped them in together, and it's been very difficult to break that idea, right? Or uneasiness of it. And this is why you actually see when it comes to children, like kindergarten teachers, usually they are women because people still believe that, like, I don't know if, you know, why would a man want to work with little children? You know, are they like pedophiles and stuff? Are they gay? And that's a really sad thing. Men who have feminine behaviors are judged by both men and women as being gay, right? They are looked down by both men and women. Some men fear bonding with other men because they may appear to be gay. So, you know, we hear about this all the time where, like, you know, they might hug each other, then they might say, like, oh, no homo, right? Because they think that being gay is a bad thing. So they're saying, although I'm hugging you, I'm not gay, which is something that's really silly. If you should be able to hug another person and not have to worry about people questioning who you are, right? In the U.S., men greet each other by slapping or roughhousing, right? You see like a high five or a bro thing or whatever. But in Europe and in Africa, men may hold hands as friends. And in America, you don't really see that because people will judge them like, oh, look at those gay people or whatever, right? Or something even more demeaning than what I just said. And so men behave with other men differently in America than it is in other countries, again, because of this fear of not being normal that we were talking about in the previous slides. Able-bodyism. People with disabilities have a long history of being discriminated against, and I'm sure you all know because you're in this field right now, right? The US emphasizes youth and fitness, focusing on body beautiful. Disability is seen as an imperfection. True, right? Just think about if you visualize or meet a person with a disability, do you go, oh, you know, there's something wrong with them? Probably, right? Unfortunately, because again, society has taught us to say, oh yeah, if you are not normal, like we were talking about before, then there's something wrong with you, that you're imperfect. Since most buildings are designed for people without disabilities, they are not aware of their privilege in the world. And that's very true, right? If you are not in a wheelchair, you don't necessarily know how difficult it is to maneuver the world in a wheelchair. Does that make sense? So a lot of buildings are designed by people who don't have disabilities, so they don't necessarily understand how a person with a disability might not be able to get into a building or get to the second floor if there's no elevator or ramp, right? They're like, well, yeah, just walk up the stairs, not realizing that not everyone can walk up the stairs. Um, Sometimes we say, think about it as a person who's older because they might have, inabilities like going up the stairs. And then they're like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll respect people who are older and we'll accommodate them, but not necessarily imagine and put into consideration a person with a disability. How does one become more aware? You can have friends who have disabilities, so make friends with people who have disabilities and you'll understand. Or you might do something, let's say if it's a wheelchair, pushing strollers on the street, because then you'll experience how difficult it is to maneuver around the world. Imagine if you did not have a curb cut. A curb cut is basically that little swoop on a sidewalk where people can then not have to walk up that little step of the curb to be able to get to the next side of the street, right? You might, as a person who has no disability, just step over the step and that's it. You keep on walking. But a person with a disability, they can't always just prop themselves up over a high curve or a low curve even. So again, people who have no disabilities have that privilege over people who have a physical disability, let's say. Within disability, men with disability are favored over women with disabilities. People assume that women with disabilities are not thought of as wives and mothers, so they've been desexualized. So even within the world of disability, men who have disabilities are more respected than women who have disabilities because people will go, well, that poor woman, she can't have children probably, no, who would want to marry her, right? And that becomes an issue. Obviously, that can also happen with men as well, but women are really seen as like, let's say if you imagine a woman in a wheelchair, like some of you guys will say, can she even have a baby, right? And stuff like that. And you don't know unless you actually know who that person is, whether or not he can or cannot have a baby. We make these assumptions because of the way that we were raised and taught in society. Consequence of able-bodyism among the able-bodied. So what we're saying is what happens to people with disabilities in a world where most people are not disabled. Do not assume that people with disabilities wish or dream of not having disabilities. And that is very true. There have been surveys, I'll give you an example, it's the deaf community. A lot of people in the deaf community don't wish to not be deaf. Okay, they're like, I'm totally fine the way I am. I don't have a disability, and that's what they say. So that's it. They can still talk. They're just talking in a different way. So imagine talking in a different language, and the different language is their hands, right? Similar to saying that people of color wish to be Caucasian. We hear about it, but it doesn't mean that everyone agrees with that, right? So just because you meet a person with a disability doesn't mean that they wish they didn't have the disability. Right? Maybe they wish that they didn't have certain pains that they experience because of their disability, but they're totally happy with their disability. That's totally fine, and they're proud of it. They see it as something that makes them unique, and that is very true. Our society leads us to make these automatic assumptions, which further makes people think being Caucasian or having no disabilities is better than everyone else. So because we assume these things, then suddenly we assume that people who have disabilities are less than, right, everyone else, when they should be treated as equals. Now let's talk about class elitism. Elite basically means like the highest level, okay? Most counselors are trained from the middle class perspective. Because you are going to college, it is a privilege to be able to go to college, right? A lot of us have to pay bills, and some of us get loans to then, go to school and stuff like that. But people often see going to school as a huge privilege. We emphasize as teachers that if you guys work hard, it means that you're going to be successful, right? English is the standard as well. You guys are expected to speak English because all of my classes are taught in English. All of our classes are usually taught in English, right? So again, there is some privilege there as well, is that we assume that everyone speaks English or should be speaking English. Um, we may feel pity for people who are lower socioeconomic status, also known as SES. We expect less from lower SES people. Sometimes they're seen as lazy. Um, and so I challenge you this because a lot of people actually do now, especially in the social justice world. I grew up in poverty personally. My parents worked really hard. They worked a lot. Did they ever get out into, like, let's say middle class? Not really. I would say that they did get a little bit above poverty, but not a lot further than that. I grew up with government aid, basically. Okay. My father, when he first came to America, uh, picked food out of garbage and ate that food, right? So this is the poverty that I grew up with. And so that's something that um, uh, we challenge because we think the American dream is to work really hard, then you'll get what you deserve. Unfortunately, I know a lot of parents, a lot of people who work really, really hard and they stay where they are. And part of that is because of the inequities in society, because of the discrimination, the oppression of their skin tone, who they are, and stuff like that. People judge them and don't give them the same opportunities as other people who have additional privileges, right? And just think about right now during the pandemic, who do we value? Well, we obviously value nurses and doctors, but we also value supermarket workers, right? Custodial people who are cleaning and disinfecting everything. Um, and now we're starting to recognize how much work is done by people who are potentially or usually in the lower socioeconomic status fields, right? And I hope that we all start to realize that we have been taught to look down on a supermarket worker or whatever customer service person when really they have been risking their lives to help people of privilege to, let's say, eat and stuff like that. And so the conversation is changing quite a bit because of this pandemic, because of the time period that we are in now where social justice warriors are bringing these things up and we realize it, right? But for a lot of us, we took it for granted. We might have looked down on a waiter and stuff like that. But now we're so grateful to have a person deliver our food to our homes, so that we don't get COVID or whatever. I mean, think about the advantage that we can do that, right? And the people who cannot do that. Okay, now let's talk about ageism. Ageism is a discrimination against people because of their age, often aimed at middle age or the elderly. And usually it's a negative view of those people. So let's give you an example. 65 as elderly is a societally made up concept due to social security system picking 65. So when you guys think of old, right? Obviously you guys probably think 30 is old. 30 is not old, okay? But I want you to say, usually people say 65 is when you're old, right? Why? It's because Social Security decided to pick 65 as the age that's old. They could have said 75, and then suddenly we would say 75 is old. They might have said 50, and then we would all say 50 is old. Again, society has decided this, and for some reason we just all accept it, right? So again, it's a made up number. What is old then? And you guys are young, you guys are fresh and all that stuff right now. Once you guys start to hit the new decade every year, or not every year, every decade, 30, 40, 50, you're going to go, actually 40 is not that bad. 50 is not that old. 60 is not that old. And it'll be funny, but you guys probably don't get it now because you think 27 is old. All right, people live longer now than when it was coined, so it is really no longer, it doesn't really make sense anymore, right? Because people do live a lot longer than they did in the past. So 65 isn't really considered old anymore. You'll actually meet people who work still at 65 when before they were encouraged to retire. Now let's give you an example about discrimination on age. Okay, women who are older, 40s and 50s, usually get breast cancer. And so there's a limited amount of research done on it because the women are in their 40s and 50s. However, if women were in their 20s and 30s and getting breast cancer, most likely, right, more research will be done on breast cancer. Do you agree? Take a moment to think about this, right? Just think about our pandemic right now. A lot of older people are dying from COVID, yet we don't necessarily use anything or do anything to really protect them. We actually even hear certain people in politics and people of, whatever, who say, you know what, if they're going to die, they die. They're old. You might as well die. They're close to death anyways. So if they get COVID and die, I guess, that's what we have to do. And just think about people saying that, not valuing a person who's older, right? And then we'll talk a little bit also about culturally differences when it comes to the perception of elderly. So people who are older are seen as having loss of control, loss of power, and the fact that because they're no longer beautiful is defined as young and fresh looking and no wrinkles and stuff, but they've lost their power. How many times have you heard or seen some older woman and then a group of people are like, oh, she's old, so sad, right? Or have you ever seen an older woman dating and you're like, why is she dating? She's so old, right? And stuff like that. The young old is when they're healthy and financially secure. So if you're younger and older, think of celebrities and stuff like that. They're young old because they don't really have worries. They have things, they're still healthy looking and stuff like that. Old is a sick or has the deficits in cognitive, medical, social, and financial resources. So someone who looks like they have a disability or does have a disability, someone who doesn't look happy and less wrinkles, you'll call them old, right? And there's a reason why when people get older, they start to get a lot of plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery because they don't want to be labeled as old. If they're going to be older, they want to be young old. So they'll do Botox and stuff like that so they appear like they're younger than they really are. There's also youth ageism. Older patients may assume such a younger person knows nothing of life experiences. And this is actually something that most of you guys will experience, unfortunately, right? If you're studying to be a counselor, right, and you are a, let's say, 27-year-old counselor, and you have an older client, they might go, what do you know about life? What do you know about suffering? You're like 24 or 25 or 26, whatever they assume. You look like you're a baby still. What have you experienced in life, right? So that would be considered youth ageism. Okay, now we're talking about implications of mental health professionals. So not acknowledging the meaning of race as a social construct can reduce your development in yourself. So what that is saying is in this chapter, for you to be aware of these things and be able to talk about it in a way that makes sense, because it can be a little uncomfortable depending on who you are. You might be seen as angry, you might be seen as defensive, right? So to be able to understand and talk about it in a way where you're neutral and in the middle will really benefit you, okay? Because people do want to have these conversations, and there's no necessary right or wrong in some of the topics that we talk about. It's just like to acknowledge that this exists, right? If you lack a core identity construct, you will not be able to help your clients fully because you will not be able to empathize. Again, empathize means to be able to be in another person's shoes, right? So if you are a person who was raised with a lot of privilege, it's hard for you to then be able to be empathizing with someone who is a person of color, let's say, if you are a Caucasian person or whatever, right? It's harder. You might say, oh yeah, I can be, but you really don't because you don't necessarily understand all the things that come along with being a minority or being LGBTQIA or whatever it is.